Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Wendy Blom, an EJN participant. This forum on accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, is presented by Equal Justice in Needham, or EJN, a group of Needham residents that's working to make our town an even better, more welcoming place to live. It'd probably be good if you put yourself on mute, just so we can hear clearly. We all know that housing prices in Needham have gone through the roof because of a Boston area housing shortage, but also because it's so profitable for developers to buy the modest houses that were characteristic of Needham before, knock them down, and build very large single-family homes. The current situation is that unless you are quite wealthy and have a sizable cash down payment, you won't be able to buy a market rate house here. The variety of available housing is shrinking, and EJN's goal is to slow this trend and provide more housing choice so that the community can include a diverse mix of seniors, young couples, and middle and working class families. We're looking at a variety of solutions, but perhaps the one most achievable in the short term is to change our zoning rules to allow homeowners to build a small apartment in their home and rent it, or rent it out for added income. For example, people just starting out in their careers, or to seniors who want to downsize and stay in Needham. In 2016, the Needham Health Department researched the challenges facing seniors in town and studied ADUs as one housing option that could help seniors remain in their own community. The Health Department advocated to the Planning Board for a fairly unrestrictive policy. And the Planning Board did create an ADU policy that was adopted by town meeting in 2019, but it's quite restrictive and very few have been built. EJN recently sponsored a citizens petition to make changes to those current ADU zoning policies. It'll be one of the items that'll be voted on at the upcoming special town meeting on October 25th. The goal of this forum is to present information to Needham residents and town meeting members about the value of adding ADUs to Needham's housing options. I expect the presentation part of the evening to run about 50 minutes, leaving time at the end for questions. So, today our panelists are Daphne Collins, zoning specialist with the Needham Zoning Board of Appeals, Amy Dain, a housing researcher who's done comprehensive studies of ADU policies and outcomes in 100 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and Oscar Mertz, an EJN housing advocate. So let's start with Daphne Collins. Daphne, please give us a description of what ADUs are and tell us about Needham's current zoning policies. You are muted. No, you're muted, Daphne.
As Wendy mentioned, the ADU was adopted in the fall of 2019. And by the time the Attorney General adopted it, we were ready to go. And we pretty much had an applicant right when we were ready, and that was in April of 2020. The ADU, what is the ADU in Needham? An ADU is a self-contained apartment in a single family detached home. It's secondary to the house, the main house, and it has to be a complete separate unit, and where there is a kitchen, there's cooking facilities, there's living facilities, sleeping facilities, and eating. The unit has to be 850 square feet or smaller. It has to have a door that connects the main house to the secondary, the ADU unit. There has to be 2 means of egress. They also have to provide off-street parking. And the owner has to live in the unit, whether the main primary unit or the ADU. The ADU has to be occupied by somebody who is related to the owner by blood, by adoption, or by marriage. And it can be a spouse, parent, sibling, child, or grandchild. If it's not a family member, it can be a caretaker. And the caretaker has to be a caretaker for the elderly, for the chronically ill, or for a disabled owner. So this is all spelled out in the zoning bylaw. The unit can be located in the attic, it can be located in the basement, it can be located in the first or second floor of the unit. It can be new construction, a totally new construction where the ADU is included. It can be an addition to an existing home, or it can also be something that has been reconfigured within the existing home. And we've seen all three of those come before us. The application, there's an application process. For an ADU, you have to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals. And so you apply for a special permit, as well as a single page application. And it's quite simple. Again, it just spells out, it almost even spells out just what I went through about what is an ADU. The application has that. If it is new construction, we will need elevations. We will need a floor plan where you can see the unit within the larger house. And if it's an existing house, then we'll need a photograph so that they can see. One of the criteria of the ADU is that the house has to look like a single family from the street. So since this application has gone through, since this amendment has gone through, since April of 2020, we have had 8 applications. And again, they are reviewed by the Zoning Board of Appeals. They have a criteria, they go right through the criteria and they look at the application, they ask the owner very specifically, is it 850 square feet? Check. You know, is it secondary to, you know, is it providing cooking, sleeping, and living? They also ask, is there an additional parking? You know, is there parking off street? So they go right through that list to make sure that you comply to the bylaw. We have seen in the process, we have seen, you know, like I have mentioned again, you know, this is not an income producing unit for the property owner. It is to provide for family relative or a caretaker. And so what I have said before, it's not about income production, it's about love. It's about housing people who in your family that need care. And you know, and I, as you know, as the staff person for the Zoning Board of Appeal and working with the applicants, you know, I find these applications to be very heartwarming. You know, there are you know, people who want their parents to move in with them. They have they come from cultures that believe in multi-generational families living together, cohabitating. And you know, in one case, I shared this another time with you all, but it was about you know, a sister whose mother had passed away, who was the caretaker for her sibling. And when her mother passed away, she created an addition. She came before the zoning board for an addition to her home so that she could go ahead and house her disabled brother with her. So the application process is one that takes about a month prior to, you know, about 3 weeks before it goes before the Zoning Board of Appeals, because we have to meet all the requirements of a special permit, which is to notify all the abutters and to put notices in the paper. Again, I think that these applications are so well done that any concerns, they're always taken care. Very few people, you know, when they see what is being produced, and I think we're going to be seeing some frontages of these units, people, the neighborhood is very, has been very happy with these. There's never been really any concerns. We haven't seen any concerns from the community. So the process, even though we know that this application, the ADU here in Needham, is very prescribed, it is a very simple process, and it's one that we are there to help you through that process. Again, the zoning bylaw is located, everything that I've mentioned to you is available in the Zoning Board of Appeals website. You can go there, and if you look under application process, there is an ADU application and the actual application process, what it takes, all the steps in an application. But in all the 8 cases that have come before the board in the last year, we've only had one continuance that needed an extra meeting, but they've all been decided in that evening. And I think that people are very, they come already just with such good intentions, and this. So
yeah. Well,
if there's any, yes.
Well, I was just going to say, probably it's not an issue now with the way the rules are, but would neighbors have the right to oppose an ADU?
The process, the Zoning Board of Appeals special permit process, is one that is open, and so we have to notify the public and abutters that are 300 feet from that unit, from the applicant. So 300 feet abutters to abutters. So it's a list that is provided by the assessors. And then there's also 2 notices that show up in the Times, the Needham Times, 2 weeks before the meeting and a week before the meeting. So it's a very open process. At the public hearing, this Zoning Board of Appeals listens to each case. And during that process, there's a moment in where it is open to the public, and anybody who has concerns, both pro or con, is allowed to make their comments. The zoning board is very open to hearing from the public, and is very open-minded to that. But in all of these cases, with the very open process and that we have not had anybody come in against these applicants.
Yeah. And again, there's less than 10, right, in Needham
At this moment,
right now?
we only have 8 at this time.
Okay, so that doesn't provide too much extra housing here in town, but it just started, I understand. Okay, well, let's move on to Amy. So Amy has done amazing research on ADUs. Can you tell us, kind of give us an overview?
Hey, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about my research on zoning for accessory dwelling units. Why is this topic important? Some of the reasons have been hit on already, but Greater Boston has a housing shortage. We're not building enough homes to meet demand for housing, and demand for housing is a dynamic thing. So it can vary depending on the economy and demographic changes and other factors. But estimates in the modeling are that Greater Boston could need hundreds of thousands of new houses to meet demand, like in the coming years. What happens when there's not enough housing? Well, you get price escalations and overcrowding in apartments and stress on household budgets, and really also homelessness in places in the region. ADUs are one piece of this puzzle. As I see it, allowing ADUs is the most conservative option for increasing housing, especially rental housing in the suburbs. It's a very incremental step. The new apartments are highly dispersed, and there's generally no need with accessory dwelling units to build additional public infrastructure to accommodate ADUs. Today, ADUs are especially needed. They're in great demand. I think that our recent changes to the economy and the global situation have made it so more people may want to house their elderly parents like on their property while there are staffing shortages at assisted living facilities and for other reasons right now. In a rocky economy, in the future years, perhaps more 20-somethings might be returning to live with their parents more, and somebody might want an accessory dwelling unit for that, or an additional kitchen for their 20-somethings. If you lose a job, rental income from an ADU can be needed. ADUs can be a way for seniors to stay in their homes. And there are many different reasons why people might want an additional unit in, but I think that it makes society a little bit more resilient for people to have more options for housing and more options for how they use their houses that they have. Do note that when you allow a homeowner to add an ADU, or when that's done, the experience is never that all owners of single family houses rush to build these. Many people like living without a rental property, without a rental unit on their property. And they choose to live in single family houses on purpose. And ADUs can be very expensive to add. So this isn't an option, something that everybody rushes to, but it's good to allow to have as an option for people. So that's sort of the background framing on this. What's my research been about? Well, I've done 2 studies about zoning for ADUs. The first was actually in 2004, and then the second one was done in 2017, 2018. In both studies, I read all of the ADU zoning bylaws and ordinances in the cities and towns of Greater Boston. And I didn't actually in either study look at the city of Boston itself. I also in both studies flipped through all of the master plans and housing plans for all the cities and towns of Greater Boston, all the suburbs, to find any recommendations that were related to ADUs. So what did I find in all those reviews? I found that in the plans, there were many recommendations across cities and towns to allow homeowners to add ADUs to their properties and to allow homeowners to rent out the ADUs and not restrict the residency of ADUs to relatives and caretakers. These recommendations in the master plans and housing plans go back a couple of decades. So planners, housing advocates, realtors have made this a priority item for advocacy actually for decades. It's not a new movement. What's the outcome of the advocacy? For my 2017 study, I surveyed specifically 100 cities and towns. I found that 68 of the 100 allow ADUs, that's 2/3, and that's the result of a tremendous amount of work, all this advocacy and planning, the master plans, the recommendations, there's been follow-up. And when you think of 68 of 100 cities and towns, that represents just a lot of work by people like all of you. There are forums held, there are hearings, there's research, there's drafting the language, a lot goes into that. And sometimes they lose the vote. Sometimes it takes a couple of town meetings to get there. So that's a lot of work to go in that 68 allow. But I found that Needham being one of them now, and this is 2017 data, so this doesn't actually include Needham in the count. But I found that 31 of the 68 municipalities that allow ADUs restrict residency in the ADU to relatives of the homeowner or caretakers. So that meant that only 42 of the 100 municipalities, so less than half, allow you to add an ADU and rent them out. So just, I feel like that's worth noting that decades of advocacy have gone in. And even though it's been a ton of work, we're at a place where there are only 42 out of 100 cities and towns in Greater Boston that allow ADUs as rentals. The residency restrictions mean that when the in-laws move out or the relative or the caretaker, you have an apartment in your house and it's illegal to, it's against the law to rent out that perfectly good apartment. And I just find that really problematic in a time period where there's a housing shortage to have laws saying you've got an apartment and if you don't have a relative or caretaker in it, you're not allowed to rent that out to somebody. Something I've heard anecdotally is that when ADUs are allowed to be rented out, many of the people who are applying for permits are building ADUs for family members. And in fact, in some places, at least like anecdotally, I've heard that most of the people applying, even where you're allowed to rent it out, are doing it for family members. Because in a way, it can be very expensive to build these, and it's not like you're going to be, if you're going to build a whole new unit, be making a ton of money in the short term if you're looking for rent. So people often get moved to get to that point of like, I'm going to go through this process and permit it and build it because I have like in-laws. This is like, I really want them to be living here and be able to take care of them, or have other reasons, or, you know, a grown child with special needs who you want on the property. But I think that the thing that's important to note is that there are some people who might not bother spending the money and going through that process if they know that in the long run they can't use that dwelling unit. So it can make a difference if people sort of feeling that this process is worthwhile to actually like know that they can rent it out after the relatives leave. So 42 of the 100 municipalities allow homeowners to add ADUs and rent them out. But most of those 42 that I surveyed and looked at their bylaws and ordinances very highly limit the houses that could add ADUs. So just to give you some examples, in Manchester by the Sea, ADUs are allowed and you can rent them out, but only on lots that are twice the minimum lot size for the zoning district. So if you have like a zoning district where a half-acre lot is the minimum lot size to build a single family house, you have to have a full acre lot in order to add an ADU. And then Manchester by the Sea says that's only for houses, you can only put them into houses built before 1984, and you have to have parking for 4 off-street vehicles. Then in Medfield, the ADUs are allowed, but only on houses built before 1938, and they have to have a minimum floor area of 2,000 square feet. And I looked it up, and actually it was a lot later than 1938 that the average new single-family house was 2,000 square feet. So like probably a lot of those houses pre-1938 are smaller than 2,000 square feet and wouldn't qualify to get an ADU. In Belmont, ADUs are allowed and you can rent them out, but only to preserve historic accessory buildings like a historic carriage house. You couldn't like build a new garage and put an ADU in or put one in your attic. In Weston, ADUs are allowed only in houses that have at least 3,000 square feet. So why not the house with 2,500 square feet? Well, really, like from how I see it, there's no good reason. And the list of extreme restrictions goes on and on across municipalities. There are a few municipalities that allow them a bit more liberally, although all municipalities sort of restrict them carefully in a whole bunch of metrics. In my research, I asked planners and building inspectors how many ADUs had been permitted in the last 3 years, and that was like 2017, 2016, 2015. And the numbers are not big. In most places, it's fewer than 5. And I was specifically asking on the number of units that have been permitted in places where you can rent it out. I wasn't surveying about the places with in-law apartments. Most places it's fewer than 5. A whole bunch of places like permitted none or 1 in a year. And the very sort of productive places that with more liberal bylaws and ordinances were up to like 12 or 15 in a year. And so I just think that that's an important point, that even if you have a more liberal bylaw or ordinance, it's not like whole neighborhoods are suddenly going to change or there's going to be construction everywhere, that this tends to be like an incremental process. The 12 units is like actually very few on the scale of all the houses in a city or town. And also asked planners and inspectors about how many ADUs had been permitted citywide or town-wide integral in history, like how many exist altogether. And few planners are keeping actual lists on this. So it was a lot of estimates. It's not handy data, but the estimates tended to be 5 to 10 total, 30, 45. A couple of planners estimated that there were 100 in the entire city or town. And the highest estimate was in Marshfield. They said they thought around 150. And these are all places that allow you to rent them out. So I think that's like important to keep in mind, that there's no experience in any place where there's like a whole town-wide like change of the housing stock. This sort of changes incrementally over time.
Amy, I just have a question. Why do you think that these towns are so hesitant to allow people to do this? It seems like there's a lot of fear there that something will happen negatively.
Yeah, well, I find that in general, people in zoning, like the experience in zoning across cities and towns, is a lot of risk aversion to change. And you know, there are a whole lot of reasons. Your house is the place where you live, and it's like often people's largest investment, and people care a lot about those things. And if you like where you live, like, why, you know, step out and allow for changes to it, I think is relatable. And people can be concerned about more construction going on in their neighborhoods, and it can be loud, or you know, like some neighbors being closer to their houses, or whatever the reasons are. But the effect is that across the entire region, because people are concerned in these ways, and often for reasons I think are totally legitimate, like, why do you want to have, like, do you want a lot of construction going on in your neighborhood? But the result is we end up with a housing shortage across the region, and escalating housing prices and homelessness and all the financial stress, and a system that's not sustainable. And housing's a human need. So we need to like think creatively about what are some solutions. And I think that one piece of that is accessory dwelling units. I also think that actually one of the hurdles to this is that the process needs to go town by town. It's a very, like, I ask some planners, like, okay, your master plan recommends that you do this, and it's been 5 years and you haven't done this yet. How come? And they're like, well, we have so many things on our agenda, and we're like rezoning the town center, and we're thinking about what to do with that school that's going to be redeveloped. And so they just haven't gotten to it because it takes so much time to do town by town. And so like when it finally gets to the top of the agenda and you work through it, and then there's the whole political process, and you end up with something very incremental. My own view on that, we're not even into the Q&A, but my own view on that is that this is such a conservative policy, and it's such an incremental one, that it's the type of thing that the state could just allow for homeowners to do. And that would sort of save a lot of this like town by town process, and leave like local committees and organizations to focus on some of the really like trickier things, like how you want to plan for growth in your town center, you know, which could lead to like even more housing, but you might want to put more attention to, versus sort of a policy like this that I think is a little bit more straightforward.
Is anybody working on a statewide policy? Is that in the works at all that you know about?
Yeah, I think that it like gets discussed, and the Realtors Association has always made ADU policies like a priority. I don't know, like the latest on like looking at that for state level legislation. But I think that it is often like something that gets put out there as an option. So
well, I know that AARP is really pushing this also for seniors.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it's becoming a big issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, in terms of my presentation, that like covered all of my points. I think that ADUs are like largely invisible and very dispersed, and the housing is needed, and housing is a fundamental need in general. So that sort of my sort of overview and framework for this. And thank you. And I'm happy. I don't know if we'll do questions at the end, or if you want to do questions now.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll wait till the end, because Oscar might cover some of the questions. So let's go to Oscar. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.
So you are the person, Oscar, who spearheaded the citizens petition to expand ADUs in Needham. Why is this issue so important to EJN and to you?
Thank you, Wendy, and Amy and Daphne for your work, and thank you for joining us tonight and sharing what you know and what you've experienced. I also hope that everyone else who's joined here is going to find this informative and learn a little bit more about ADUs and continue to advocate for the possibilities of this change. The citizens petition has come about largely because in having conversations in town with members on boards and with people who are working in the departments in town, there's a lot of people who have put time into this effort and have opinions about ADUs. And I think the one thing that has, and Amy's touched on it, Daphne's touched on it, is that it seems like it's a decision that is not overly complicated to decide as a town that we could take the next step from our bylaw and advance and add some of the options that making these rentable units rentable would add. It's a huge opportunity that I think is the time is now. I mean, we know housing is very tight. We know obviously the cost of housing in Needham in particular is going in the going higher and higher. So there are fewer and fewer choices at this lower end. So that this fills a niche is one piece of the whole housing puzzle, but it's an important one for a lot of reasons. And what I'd like to do is share a little bit about some of the research that was done by the Department of Public Health, which was done in 2016 and 2017, similar to when Amy was doing her work. And what's interesting about it is this was all done in advance of Needham voting for having their discussions about and then creating their bylaw. And in short, the Department of Public Health and the Council on Aging in Needham were strong advocates for two aspects of ADUs because they found in the research they did for seniors, they did an extensive survey, interviews with the senior community in Needham, and they found there were two issues that were coming up and were the greatest challenges for seniors, and that was transportation as people aged and needed to move on from being able to drive to relying on other forms of transportation, and housing. And in particular, the housing issues were that they, with a fixed income, as you aged in place, you were getting more and more stressed economically. So the challenge or the opportunity to be able to rent a small apartment on your property would be great opportunity. So those were the sort of the two-pronged approach to the research. And so I think what was interesting was that they decided that they would go and look at 9 towns, and they looked at they were all sort of socioeconomically about the same, although you could argue they have some differences in the numbers of housing units, but they do have a somewhat of a cross section of socioeconomic profile that seems to match, and so they felt that was a good way to kind of pinpoint their research. And so it involved a lot of data collection and a lot of interviewing. They did talk to a lot of the members of planning boards and building departments to get the information and get the experiences and get recommendations from these towns. And what was interesting was that all of these towns had, as Amy described, had come at the same kinds of issues. And I'd like to just read some of the concerns that they felt they were going to be addressing. So one of the challenges that they felt they were needing to face was important. It says the text of the bylaws of all 9 towns described similar goals: increase housing options while maintaining the character of the town, help young and older adults and people with disabilities stay in town as their needs change, and provide moderately priced units in communities with ever-escalating home prices and reduced number of small houses. 2 communities explicitly added the goal of helping workers live near the places of employment, which is interesting. Interviewees noted that their bylaws were drafted to address key concerns residents expressed about ADUs, namely that they might change the appearance of a neighborhood from one of single-family homes to one that looks crowded, allow 2-family homes in areas zoned single-family homes, and increase density, stress on public services, the number of children, traffic, and cars parked outside a house. Everything that we've heard from Amy's research. The regulations in the 9 towns are similar in their intent to meet the goals and address the concerns that we just went through. They ensure that the unit is clearly part of and smaller than the main dwelling and that the ADU doesn't change the overall character of the neighborhood. Most of the regulations are consistent with the recommendations that are also in the Massachusetts model bylaw. So there is actually a bylaw that the state has created. So we're kind of on the way there to potentially thinking about this as a state mandate, which would be interesting. I think it sounds like a good idea to advocate. So the impact of the bylaws. The impact of the ADU bylaws in the communities surveyed has been minimal. Only a small number of ADUs have been created over the course of many years. For residents who have been able to take advantage of this option, ADUs have served their intended purpose, as Daphne has clearly said. People really did need them, and they solved their problems. Older adults and their children are able to share property, or older adults are able to afford to stay in their home by renting out a unit, which we can't do yet. Other effects of passing an ADU bylaw have been bringing illegal and possibly unsafe units into compliance and creating appropriate housing for people with disabilities. So this is interesting. We've had conversations with David Roach, who's our building commissioner, and he has said that one of the things he has to deal with and hasn't fully solved his or found a solution is that there are a lot of people who obviously create a unit. Perhaps they don't put the stove in yet, and then they have an opportunity to go rent that out later on when they've already gotten their certificate of occupancy from town. So there is something potentially quite beneficial. There would be far less enforcement requirements for the building officials to have to worry about whether this is going to go into the under the cover or not be daylit. So I think there's something advantageous to actually making rentable units part of our bylaw. None of the interviewees reported an increase in the number of school children, traffic, or change in the character of the town due to the ADU bylaw. Planning boards and housing advocates in 7 of the 9 communities decided to liberalize their regulations in the past few years to encourage more people to take advantage of this option. 6 of the towns approved changes, indicating overall satisfaction with the general concept of the accessory apartments. So what that basically is telling us, and I think this was what was interesting, that from all of this research, the experiences of the 9 communities described in this report provide compelling evidence that ADUs could contribute to the overall goal of increasing housing options for older adults, young adults, people with disabilities, and people with moderate incomes without negatively impacting the quality of life. Using this mass model bylaw and the experiences of the 9 communities as guides, Needham can create a bylaw that ensures units will be integrated into the existing single-family neighborhoods with little or no negative impact on the character of the neighborhood or on town services, provide new options for current Needham homeowners, and minimize the regulatory burden on town officials. So I think that was pretty compelling and was all brought to that discussion for in 2019, and so we are where we are, and I think from a lot of concern about just in general trying to find ways to make broader choice in Needham for housing options. This is one of them that seems to be a critical to that small unit, and given that it has so few little impact, so few numbers, and that Amy described that if you remove restrictions, you do gain a little bit more desire to do these. So you're going to have an increase in the numbers of the units that would be coming to the building department and going through the zoning board of appeals. But I think the numbers are still pretty small. And so I guess it feels like this, and the reason for this position was to basically put this out back on the front burner and have this be an issue that we could address with the select board and the planning board in the spring. And I think we just feel, as the group that was trying to advocate for this, that it's one of the tools in the toolkit to add choice, and particularly at this lower end on the size of these units. So I think that's
Yeah.
kind of it in a nutshell.
We have to acknowledge that over 90% of Needham's residential area, is zoned single family. So that's a large area that is very restricted in numbers of people. And
Yeah,
so
I think
the
it's
different desires between I know a lot of people in town would want workers to be able to live in town, or want their babysitters to be able to live in town, or want a young couple to be able to live in town. And then there are the people who say, oh no, it would be against the character of the town. Well, somehow the character of the town always wins.
Well, I think that's, well, and you're basically saying that the character of these individual houses with these ADUs is one of the reasons the ADUs are appealing, is that they're intended to not change the character. So this leaves other debates about other kinds of housing, to come. But I think as one choice, as one option for housing, ADUs are
Yeah.
strong and important thing to think about. And so,
Well, we are fortunate to have somebody from the planning board here. Jeanne McNight is here. I don't know if Jeanne wants to say anything. And meanwhile, people should put questions in the chat and I will definitely put them forward. So Jeanne, do you have anything to add about the planning board's plans?
I guess the one thing I would add in response to Oscar's comments and also to Amy Dain's comment, Amy said that many communities, when asked, why aren't you proposing this or why aren't you studying this, say, well, it's in our master plan, but it's kind of, we're too busy right now. We have all these other things we need to study. And recently, when I began actually collecting some information on how many units we had and that sort of thing, and I talked with Daphne, and I brought it up at a planning board meeting, and that was the response I got. And very sincerely, we are going to undertake a very serious look at our affordable housing, our multifamily housing, our inclusionary zoning, the whole stretch of land along Highland Avenue. It's going to be a busy year. And so the response was, well, we've only had these for 1 year. Let's just wait and see another year. And, we just put it off. And I think, when Oscar realized that that was the response, he took it upon himself to basically, organize this petition article. And the petitioned article, I want to point out, is not itself a petition for an amendment to the zoning bylaw. That process is quite complicated. It takes more time than was possible this spring. It's to urge the select board and the planning board to include this in our housing study, to give it a higher priority. And that's really what the petition does.
Wendy,
Yes.
no, you're
Oh, I had to unmute. Yeah, Amy and Daphne, do you have anything to add about that could clarify anything for steps we can take?
I just wanted to kind of substantiate what Amy was saying. In terms of the ADUs here in town, they're scattered all over the place. They're both in the SRA and SRB districts. So, I'm thinking, when we've been pretty steady. We've been having pretty steady clip of applicants. But what I've noticed is it's not all in one corner of town. It's everywhere, it's everywhere. And again, I'm seeing all types of people who are applying for these. So we really, it really does, just like some of the studies have been showing, it really is very reflective of the applicant, and it's not reflective of geography or housing type. It really is reflective of the individual, and as I think that as we see more, even in this very restricted, bylaw here in Needham, I think it's going to again reflect what Amy was talking about in terms of ADU out there.
Okay, great. Well, I have a question here from Smriti. Would any of you have any information about the impact ADUs might have on the tax base of the towns that allow them, and thus the financial budgetary impact of an expansion of ADUs?
I mean, my sense in terms of like the numbers coming in, also, it's very small. So it's not like you have like a huge, you will not see a huge influx of residents and needing like all sorts of services or to grow schools because you have an ADU policy. Also, there's been a trend towards shrinking household sizes over time. So houses have fewer residents. And so allowing ADUs is just like, it's not even going to catch you up with the number of residents per property that there were, 30 years ago. So I don't think in that way it adds, it's very taxing of the tax base. And also this is a kind of policy where you don't have to like build new streets or expand your sewer system or build new sidewalks to accommodate it. It's just going on people's properties and plugs in with existing infrastructure. In terms of like added workload to for building inspectors, I think compared to like all the home renovations and things going on, these just aren't at a level to like be very large. I asked about it in my research in terms of like staffing of it, and I just like, it didn't sound to me like something that was like overwhelming time, like staff. I think that there are some more requirements when you restrict residency, that's something often, I feel like a lot of departments weren't doing what the regs asked them to do to make sure that the occupants were relatives of the homeowners, but often there were sort of burdens, like onerous requirements of the planning departments to like be making sure that there's like an annual recertification that the residents are relatives and things like that. I don't know about in Needham's current bylaw what that was like. So this shouldn't be like a big issue in terms of budgeting, I would think.
Thank you. Yeah, Paula, did you want to make your observation?
Yeah, and I have something else I'd like to share, but Amy mentioned, Amy, when you were asked what some of the objections or concerns were about ADUs, one of the things you mentioned was construction noise, which we can all agree is unpleasant. But I gotta say, given the amount of construction of very, very large single family homes that are going on in town, I really don't think that holds any water in this particular case. So
Yeah.
to mention that we have a lot of construction going on and nobody seems to be objecting. I did, just prior to this, start looking for a 1-bedroom apartment in Needham. And what I found is that there's very little available, that most of it is in larger buildings, larger apartment buildings. And I was kind of shocked to see that at something called Hamilton Highlands, which I think may have another name as well, 1 to 2 bedrooms, 1 to 2 baths, 900 to 1325 square feet. So a little bit larger, than these would be, and they were on for $2,150 to $2,700. There were a couple of, like, somebody owned a condo and wanted to rent it out, and that looked like a 1-bed, 1-bath, probably, like, again, a little bit larger, but not necessarily. And there I saw a couple for like $1,800 or $1,500. But very few. So my point is only that there's very little rental housing. I am concerned about people who work in town and would like to live in town. Or as Wendy mentioned earlier, a young couple, our children who want to stay in town, students coming back from colleges, living in nearby, working in nearby towns, that there's very little housing stock for 1-bedroom apartments, period, and what there is extremely expensive. So this would be a good addition.
One thing that I looked at in my research is whether ADUs are allowed as a matter of right or by special permit. So it was interesting to hear from Daphne about the experience of special permitting in Needham. I don't have like the stats in front of me right now on how many allow by right and how many by special permit. A lot of places require special permit. And one of the questions I asked in the research was, have you ever rejected an application for an ADU by special permit? And I think like Daphne was saying, across places like no, like the requirements tend to be very straightforward. Applicants go in knowing like, here are the items I either qualify or don't. And then all of the applications that had been rejected were clearly just not like their lot wasn't big enough, or there was something that was just wrong, but there weren't like sort of discretionary points where it was like, well, we just don't like you, or like, I don't like, not, we don't think this is a good one for like qualitative reasons. So in that way, like it wasn't a risky process to go through a special permit, because if you qualified, you would get your permit in almost all cases. So in that way, I was thinking, hey, maybe special permits aren't so bad because it's a straightforward process. I've been convinced otherwise, and advocates have been pushing to allow these by right everywhere. And I've heard from friends like in Newton who wanted to put in ADUs, they just get scared. Like, I'm going to go through this whole process and I don't know for sure that I'm going to get the permit, and a letter is going to be sent out to my neighbors. And I have another friend actually who's building an ADU, and they could have done one detached by special permit, like a backyard cottage. But if they did it attached to their house, it was by right, and they just didn't want to go for the special permit. So they did it attached, and they lost a window in their kitchen by like putting the unit right next to behind them. They're doing it for their in-laws, even though they can rent it out in Newton, but they just wanted to bring the, grandparents onto the property. But, like that was just like, people are saying, no, I don't want to go through this process if there's any risk. And these are individual homeowners. These aren't like developers who are doing this, who, are used to the process. So I think like to just make it more straightforward, if you're allowing any way and the criteria are really straightforward, just allow it by right, and it can be something that a building inspector can look at the plans and say, yes, this qualifies. You can have your building permit without needing to go through that process of public notification and hearing.
I want to mention here in Needham, kind of to the process here, we really want all our special permits, but in particular ADUs, but to make it very predictable, simple, and easy. And thank God, the town meeting, by the time, town meeting adopted it, and by the time we were ready to be ready for the ADU application, we created it. But it was always just to keep it simple. It's a question of check marks. It's very simple. The application almost self-explanatory, and even in the back page, we kind of have bullets, but we try to keep it predictable and simple. And if you go onto the Zoning Board of Appeals website, you can see that application, that it's very simple. And then we've also created a process. You also need to remember that our very first applicant was in March of 2020 when we went remote. And the Zoning Board of Appeals was the first board who went remote. And we were able to walk them through that. And I think that listening to what Amy says, I think that the town, not only making it predictable and simple, but also it just fits with the way that Needham works in terms of the special permits. We try to work, and we also work very closely with applicants. So if I have applicants that are kind of nervous, we walk them through, we help them out, but basically keep it simple, keep it predictable. And I think that if it expands, we will always be committed to that same predictability and simplicity.
I'll make a I'll make a quick comment in
Sure.
response to something that was said with regard to recertifications and the burden of having to have the town building inspector recertify the occupancy every year. That was something that was recognized when we went to town meeting for this. And our bylaw provides for that recertification every 3 years, not every year. Yeah.
Okay. Oscar, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to ask Jeanne if she has any thoughts on whether or not the current bylaw for the restrictive residency would ever be considered in your eyes as something that could be by right, and that you might add the idea that this could be a rental unit as the special permit. Is that something that could be a way forward?
Imagine such a change. And I think what would need to be presented is pretty much what Daphne presented. And some might think we need one more year of experience to show it. Is that look at these applications, they really are quite routine. The building inspector could handle it. As somebody said, the discretion that's available to the board to say no has never been used. And in other towns, I think Amy said the same thing. Well, if, it's only to look at, oh, well, they don't meet this particular criteria, that lot size isn't big enough. Well, obviously, that's something that the building inspector can determine and deny the permit.
Right.
So I do think it's possible. It may be people would like to see a little longer time that we live with it.
Yep. Okay.
Also, with the process also in terms of just keeping track of what's out there, like the number of, housing units, the ADU units. I know, like, we were talking, Oscar, before we came on about the illegal units. I mean, really having a clear, predictable process is one way of Needham keeping track of, like, these are how many units we have there. I mean, we have, we were talking about spreadsheets. We know exactly how many units we have. And at any moment in an application, we have 8 units. We know where they are. And then the reason we did that is because the zoning law requires, again, this every 3 years. They have to apply. So we already have it plugged in on Outlook, and the building department has Viewpoint Cloud. And so it's going to be a trigger. And we've decided the 3 year is the third year when they get their certificate of occupancy, not when they apply to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So when this unit comes live, then the 3 years. So then we go ahead and so we all have this kind of communication process we've already put in place because it was in place. When this came on board, we right away built it in and we're ready. So, it's going to be a good 3 years from now before the first case goes and gets recertified. But it exists. And I think that if something gets simplified, again, just having a process, keeping track of these things so that the community knows what's out there. It's not something to be afraid of.
How are you going to verify that it's a caretaker or a family member?
You know what, this is the Zoning Board of Appeals was very concerned about that. And so what they did is on the application, they have to sign it. And they say they're certifying this, and that's where it is. It's left to, it's the application and that it's in the application and when they're applying.
Okay.
Amy, can I ask you a question? So in the research that you did on, I'd like to probably drill into this a little bit more with our Department of Health too, about the towns and why towns went back to go through this process again to remove the restrictions. It would be interesting to know some of those debates and how that came about and how much they changed and whether they did go from special permits to and by right, or continue to have the special permit. It seems like with this system set up, as Daphne described it, it seems like it's a relatively focused discussion about making changes to the rules with the system in place and debating that. And again, just knowing that the numbers are so small and that it is such a focused unit housing type, it would seem like it would be something that you could do without having to be part of a much larger discussion. But in any case, I appreciate the requirements that may be there for additional research, but it seems like
in my research, the report does list places that have revised their ADU bylaws in the last decade. And it is something like, because it is in all the plans, it's something that like places do work through and come to in groups like this, or bring it up on the agenda, to make it happen. And I think it's a great policy. When I say like, I hope the state would do it so you can like focus your attention elsewhere, I still recognize like that while that isn't allowed by the state, it's really important that you do this, that everyone does this work and allows them town by town. So it's really wonderful what you're doing and looking at it. Yeah, and in terms of towns revising, my sense is often when they come back to it, they rewrite it pretty dramatically often, like maybe it had first been adopted 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and it's a different group of people looking at it. Usually they so recently, so it might be just looking at like, can you rent it out? But there are a whole bunch of factors to look at. I think your current one is for a maximum of 850 square feet. Like Newton's is, I think, 1,200 square feet. Or it might be some places allow like a certain amount by right and then more by special permit. And there are a whole bunch of different factors you can look at. I'm a real advocate for allowing this on very small lots. Newton did a study, and it's interesting to hear like that Needham's experience is that they're all over. Newton had originally just allowed these on very large lots. And so large lots in Newton are like your mansions, like that's like the most expensive housing. And they were finding that people in the most expensive housing, like were rarely applying for these. And when they looked at illegal ADUs, it tended to be in houses on smaller lots where, maybe people couldn't afford the nursing home and wanted, like they were going to put their in-laws at their house, and I don't know, or wanted the rental income, because really like in the mansions, they didn't need the rental income. So they, from that analysis, said really like this should be allowed on smaller lots too. And I do think like saying that it's just on large lots in the context of suburbs is really exclusionary. It's to say like, we really only want this if you're very wealthy to be able to do this. And if you're, and even like the smaller lots of Newton and Needham and communities like that are super expensive too. Like, and we should be allowing it there too.
Do we have more questions, Wendy?
Paula has one.
Daphne, you mentioned that, I didn't realize this. Let's say I own a home and I have an ADU and it's approved and it's built, that I could live in the ADU and have my family live in the
larger homes.
Is anybody
Absolutely.
doing that?
No, they are the secondary units. Although there was one case where they were going to flip. They were going to flip it. The applicant said that, yeah, so it was, and it was her daughter and her son-in-law and I think it was 3 little ones.
Yeah.
And so that's what she was going to do. Yeah. So we have had one case of that. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking it would have to be the family members that are defined in the bylaw. Like it could be my cousin and my sister.
Cousin? It's really interesting. The planning board was very specific about cousins weren't in it.
Right. That's
yeah, it was
I think you mentioned this before, Daphne, right? If
Yeah.
they're very restrictive. Yeah.
It was very restrictive, and in fact, it was one of those moments when I was trying to come up with the application form, like trying to figure out like what is the because it was so specific.
Yeah.
And I think the planning board opened it up to grandchildren, which is a reality. A grandchild living with a grandparent. You know, people were saying, "I want my grand." You know, it was one of those things where the reality of family living. You know, grandchildren made a lot of sense. So they opened that up. And, you know, before, you know, I think it was a little, when it was being created, when the amendment was being designed. But one of the things that, you know, even though we have 850 square feet, not everybody's maximizing it up to 850 square feet. We have, you know, I think the average is probably around 700. You know, we have had some of our units at 590 square feet. So, so it you know, it's not, they're not maxing out the 850 square feet. But as you can see, they look like a regular home, but that is part of the bylaw, that it has to appear as a single family to the front as you go by. So it hasn't really altered the streetscape. It doesn't alter the streetscape that exists now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and for participating in this. And I hope people have learned something about them and can explain to their town meeting member that they should support this, and maybe we can move this forward a little faster, because there's such a need for housing and diversity of housing here in town. So thank you very much, Oscar, Daphne, and Amy, for coming.
Thank you.
So much for giving us your time.
Well, thanks to everybody who came, and look forward to talking more about this.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.